There is so much fear and so much confusion regarding these deportations. First of all, Supreme Court overnight ruled the Trump administration cannot deport Venezuelan migrants currently being held in immigration custody. Why the block? Under what basis? The ACLU says the White House is using an archaic rule from the 18th century.
Yeah, this is a highly unusual decision from the Supreme Court, and I think it highlights that the Supreme Court now sees the urgency and the severity of the situation. The reason it is so unusual is that the lower courts had not had an opportunity to issue a ruling. The Fifth Circuit had not ruled. In fact, the Supreme Court said in its order, until the Fifth Circuit rules, no deportations can occur. So that they're stepping in early just highlights how fast this is moving, and also is an indication, I think, that the judiciary understands that the Trump administration is not likely to maybe respect the lower court orders, as we've seen in some of these other cases.
And just how many times has this Alien Enemies Act been used in our history?
Very rarely. It is an act from the late 1700s. It is intended to be utilized by the executive against enemy combatants during a time of war. So the Trump administration theoretically is claiming that we are at war with enemy combatants of Venezuela. I think that is very arguable. It has this question of whether the Trump administration can use the Alien Enemies Act overall under these deportations has actually not been taken up yet by the upper court. So at this point, we're just talking about individual cases and deportations, but the overall question about the usage of the Alien Enemies Act is still up in the air. And most of the constitutional scholars that have looked at this indicate that they don't think that this would be a legal usage by the Trump administration of this act.
And certainly it hasn't been used since World War II for Japanese Americans who were interned. All right, let's move on now. And regarding Abrego Garcia, an appeals court ruled the administration can't just sit there and basically do nothing. It must work on bringing Garcia back to the U.S. The Supreme Court says the White House must facilitate his return from El Salvador. Trump says Garcia will never live in the U.S. again. Procedurally, then, what happens next if there is a status quo?
Well, we're in a waiting period. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a pretty blistering judicial opinion. It's quite a good read. I recommend that people who like reading judicial opinions take a look at this one that was written by a Republican judge. At this point, we're in a 2-week waiting period to allow the Trump administration to demonstrate to the courts what they are doing to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return. And so we're in a holding pattern. We're not yet at the point where the courts have ruled clearly and the Trump administration is defying them in this particular case. But all indications publicly from the Trump administration, what the White House is putting out in their social media, suggest that they don't intend to comply. Whether that is going to be what they submit to the court under their 2-week deadline, I think is another question, and we just have to wait and see.
And then, Kate, all of this is basically leading to escalating tension between two equal branches of government. And it is really extraordinary where we find ourselves. How rare is this level of division? And who wins this battle in the end of the day?
This is unprecedented. Our nation has never seen this level of battle between the judiciary and the executive branch, and it is very concerning because if we do reach the point where the courts clearly tell the executive to do or to not do something, and it openly defies the court, what happens next is a question mark for everyone, because of the courts don't have an army, of course. And so then the executive will have amassed all of the power, and we will no longer have checks and balances is what that will mean. And it's a very scary prospect for people who are watching.
It really is unprecedented. I want to broaden out our discussion a little bit. So while there's been a lot of focus right now on these male immigrants, allegedly violent or gang members, other deportations are still happening in this country, including that of young children. With funding cuts tied to DOGE, there are fewer legal representatives now able to help some of these children, some as young as 3 years old. What happens to them in this process? How are they supposed to fend for themselves?
That is another horrific aspect of all of this that, is even less talked about because we're so focused on these CCTV deportations to El Salvador, but they have slashed all the funding for the nonprofits that are providing representation and rights presentations to these kids and these families in detention. I'm based in Central Texas. There's two very large family detention centers, and attorneys don't have access to those families and those children, and they go at it alone without attorneys. They go in before judges and they get deported, and bad things happen to them, and conditions are not great in these detention centers, and these families and these kids don't have access to justice. It's really a travesty.
Yeah, and they're being lost in all of the shuffle. As we say, we're focusing so much on this El Salvador and people being deported to that prison there. I've also heard about or know many people, legal residents living here in the U.S., minorities predominantly, worried about traveling overseas, worrying if they will be let back in. Should they be worried, or are they being paranoid?
I think there's cause for concern, and what I tell people is to make sure that if you are a green card holder and you're leaving the country, that you don't have a criminal history, or if you do, and let's say you had an arrest that was dismissed, that you take a certified copy of the disposition of that dismissal. Make sure you're not going out of the country for longer than 6 months at a time. And if you have engaged in protests or demonstrations or other pro-Palestinian activities on social media, be aware of that and be very cautious about what happens when you come back in. But I also think it's really important to remember that CBP does not have the authority to revoke someone's green card at the airport. They may take away their actual card and place that person in proceedings before a judge, but they can't take away their status as a permanent resident. So also knowing your rights before you get to the airport is a really critical thing.
That is a very important point you just made. All right, we will have to leave the conversation there. Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.